Whenever you guys are ready, I can
I'm gonna
probably open this first before I... Cool. Some nice sound texture for everybody. I'll include it somewhere.
It'd be his special intro for Osborne.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have done this before. I don't want to have to open this. I just want to have these written down.
Ooh,
Yeah.
interesting.
That was also my reaction.
And I thought it was a fruited beer. Michael, is this like a sour? But it's not.
No, it's not. It's like beer punch.
The stories we've read capture our attention and immerse our minds in settings of all kinds to bring us the spectrum of feelings and deliver the tale of tales to our starving psyches.
Whether it's medieval-style fantasy with mages and knights,
Or hard sci-fi takes on the future of space colonization.
or thrillers set in your backyard, world building is the foundation that holds up the narrative, the glue that keeps it from unraveling as readers follow the journey you laid out for them, all to make the stories jump from the pages and burn themselves into our memories.
Welcome, weary writers, to Book Career in a Year's network of podcasts. This is Worlds Asunder, an insightful podcast on world and character building.
My co-host is the one and only David Shadoin, better known as Shady. It's not just a descriptor, it's also his moniker.
And she's the H.Y. Gregor, but you can call her Haley or Sour Patch, your friendly post-apocalyptic wasteland elf.
We know. We have nearly a score of published novels and short stories between us, but who the hell are we to teach you about world building and character development? We get it, which is why we decided to call in some favors.
Each week, we pull from a list of the best and brightest authors, editors, and publishers to give tips and guidance on tackling the age-old questions and provide you with tools on how to accomplish world building like the pros. From environment to magic to characters, how do we strike a balance between what matters to our audiences and what matters to keep it all straight? Open up your ear holes
And your minds.
and get ready for us to tear Worlds Asunder.
So, if you're ready.
Just knock and enter.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Worlds Asunder. This time we're hitting it right at the end of a 3-day con. So if we're a little lower on energy, or if it seems a little mellower, that's because we're really dragging on the energy right now.
If we all sound like we have smoker's rasps, it's because we've done nothing but talk for 3 days straight.
Or sing karaoke.
You're saying Carrie.
There you go. I'm one of your co-hosts, David Shady Shadoin, both a moniker and a descriptor. As always, I am joined by the lovely H.Y. Gregor, Haley. And today she is going to introduce you to our guest.
All right. So today we have Jon R. Osborne. So Jon has 8 published books and we think 20-ish anthology publications. We're not totally sure on the number.
20-ish, yeah.
It's a good problem to have when you lose track. His publications right now primarily with CKP. He's also got some stuff coming out with 3 Ravens Press coming in the future. He is a core author with the Four Horsemen universe, which we've talked about a little bit already on the podcast, so science fiction. And then he is also the creator of the Milesian Accords, which is currently a 5-book urban fantasy series that we're going to talk about a little bit today. Oz, do you want to add anything to your introduction? Let us know anything?
I'm also an incredible nerd, 40-year plus gamer, and I like beer.
And this is, yes, he likes beer.
In fact, Haley followed up in the hashtag #BringOzBeer by bringing me beer, which I appreciate.
Author branding, bring Oz beer. So it's not exactly a bribe, but
It doesn't hurt.
yeah, it doesn't hurt. Okay, so to go ahead and start out, one of the things we talked about, we wanted to do a little bit more of a deep dive on some of the topics, but I want to ask a general question first. So you have written a lot in the Four Horsemen universe, which is science fiction, military science fiction, in a lot of ways, and then you have done the Milesian Accords, which is urban fantasy. So what differences have you noticed, generally speaking, in world building between those two genres? What were like the biggest things that you noticed you had to approach differently when writing those drastically different styles?
For urban fantasy, because I'm tapping into mythology and real-world locations, it actually requires research. In science fiction, if you need to make up a world or an alien race, you can just make it up. Or you can choose from one of the ones that are already in the Bible. But if I cite a specific place and someone's been there, they'll know if I'm wrong. I literally had people say, oh, hey, I know when you wrote this book because the gas station wasn't built until after 2009.
Don't get that wrong, because people are paying attention. And obviously there's some research things that come in with science fiction as well, but people can't necessarily say, or they shouldn't, you did this wrong.
No.
So that's a distinctive difference.
Does that then play into like current events too, right?
Actually, I try to keep current events out of the Milesian Accords because I don't want to restrict it to a very specific time frame. And also, as current events age, it can kind of seem dated. Like if you've watched an old movie or something like that, and it's like, they're like, well, what are they talking about? That doesn't make sense. Well, it's because it happened 10, 20, 30 years ago. And hopefully my books are being read that far in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and your series is great. They're really good. Check them out. He's got a lot of traction online. There's a lot coming. He has big plans, so it's a pretty exciting universe. Okay, so actually that leads us into one of the main things that I wanted to discuss with you. So urban fantasy, generally, magic coming into the real world, and it doesn't always touch on mythology, but that's something that you have delved a lot into in your books. Do you want to tell us how that started or what got you interested in that and what the considerations were?
Well, the basic conceit of the Milesian Accords stems from the Irish invasion cycle. Le Borga Borarin is the book that it first appeared in, where the various waves of supernatural races, settled Ireland, and the next one come in, they'd go to war, and it ends with the Milesians, who are the humans, descendants of Noah, coming in and driving the Tuatha Dé Danann into the underworld. And I was like, well, what if there was a way for them to come back? And that just started like my brain percolating the whole idea of bringing magic back. And then one day while I was driving, the first scene with Pixel approaching Liam in the bookstore just like formed in my head.
So for those who don't speak Welsh or know how to spell any of these words, will you go into the Tuatha Dé Danann? Did I say that one right? I listened to the audio.
At least as close as I get. So.
Yeah. So tell us in the layman's terms. You've got Fae, essentially, right? The folk is what you call them.
The fairy folk, the fair folk, the Seelie or the She.
And what have you focused on? If you could elaborate a little more, you've got a couple of different mythos that you've looked at, but you've primarily focused on really just one. Right?
Well, I primarily focus on Irish. And then, because some people confuse Irish and Celtic as being the same thing.
I would be one of those people.
When in fact, there's, when you have Irish, you also have, Scottish, Welsh, Manx, Old Britannic. So predominantly, I focus on Irish because that's where the invasion cycles happens in Irish mythology.
Okay.
But for example, both Pixel and Govannon have roots in Welsh mythology. And then, of course, I had to sneak in some Norse because, everyone loves, Vikings and stuff like that. That's why I brought in Einar.
Yes, and actually that leads up another question. So with that, you mentioned we've got all these different, British Isles cultures. Have you run into, with your research or with readers, people saying, hey, this is wrong?
Not yet. Part of the advantage of working with something that is so far back and has less of a body of well-known work is it does give you a little more room to be creative or to fill in gaps. Plus, I like to say, this is not a history book.
Right.
Yeah, at least having read Reluctant Druid, right? It is very clear that there are certain things you're making reference to, but because it's not a history book, you don't really have to divulge all the stuff that would normally get debated by scholars or called out by different people who actually studied. So then moving forward from there, is it almost easier, especially in an urban fantasy setting, to protect the historical stuff more than it is to try and project the future of the world, or even because you're playing only a few years back, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So is your memories of those places, does that sometimes get a little hard to account for when you're writing?
It can, because, well, for example, the reason why it's set in Western Illinois is because my grandparents lived there. And so I spent my summers in a small town of 3,000 people out in Western Illinois. So I actually had never visited Eureka before. It was just happenstance that there's a town near Peoria with the name Eureka, and it was just too perfect for a fantasy series. But, a lot of my memories of Illinois and what I used to build the Illinois setting comes from those memories, which are, given my age, 40, 50 years out of date.
Yeah.
So we'll loop back to that because I know that in your book, which I failed to mention, I apologize. So this is one of Oz's publications. This is nonfiction. We spoke with Chris Kennedy, who has another book in this another volume in this series. This one specifically is Worldbuilding for Novices. And so this has a whole bunch of different topics. It's both general and specific. You have the breakdown. It's useful for any genre, but he does touch a little bit on different genres and some of the differences, the considerations that you have to make. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that because you do have a section about tools and what's useful, resources that you can use. So that's, I'll put a star over here to remember that.
I'm going to call that the Vault of Knowledge.
Vault of Knowledge.
Yeah, you can find it on Chris Kennedy Publishing's Vault of Knowledge. As you can see, there are at least 5 volumes.
And remind us the name of the imprint.
Oh, Quillcraft Press.
Quillcraft Press with Chris Kennedy Publishing.
That's
so
the real name.
There's 4 or 5. Though this is the most recent one.
Yes, this is the newest one.
Yeah, it just came out in January, and it's been a great resource. So go ahead and check that one out. So to continue, I guess, talking about where you sort of take your creative liberties. I know that one of the things you addressed in your Bible for Milesian was that you're trying to avoid huge kind of earth-shattering, world-ending conflict. And you're trying to generally avoid some of the bigger, really recognizable mythology figures.
Right.
So can you address a little bit of why?
Well, as far as world-shattering events, unlike Buffy, you can only have so many Ragnaroks or apocalypses. And if you do that, especially early on in a series, then anything after that is either going to be an imitation or it's going to pale.
Okay.
That's fair. Yeah, and I can imagine with the way that you've crafted Milesian, where it's very, very character driven, very character development driven, that having those big kind of conflicts really overshadows a lot of that stuff, which is supposed to be the central focus. So when you go to pick conflicts, how do you kind of what's your process on picking some of those conflicts to keep it, or are you even going to touch anything anywhere close to try and bring down maybe if you had the idea of I kind of want an allusion to Ragnarok, but I'm going to scale it down, I'm going to scale certain events of it. Would that be something that's a part of your process?
Well, the whole idea of the challenge in and of itself, we'll avoid spoilers, but if it succeeds or fails, it could be a huge paradigm shift. Mm-hmm. Because if it succeeds, that means magic comes back to the world, and that's a double-edged sword that Liam's looking at. Mm-hmm. If it fails, then it means magic's never coming back probably, and so now that's locked out forever.
Well, and in avoiding those kinds of huge conflicts, the world-ending kind of things, you're not writing alternate history.
Right.
And so there's, I'm sure, kind of that fine line between figuring out how do we sort of keep current events out of it so we're not potentially dating it or causing, bringing up controversial things potentially, but also not changing things so dramatically that it feels like the genre has shifted.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a reason why I never say when the first challenge happened. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't even allude to the actual century. We know, based on some other characters, that it is before the year 1000. And it's probably closer to the early first millennium. But as soon as you say, well, okay, it happened in the year 237, then you set yourself up for people being able to say, well, wait, this hadn't happened by then, or you allude to this, and that's a century off.
I think you maybe would also run into, if you're using a certain character from folklore or mythology, if they hadn't been in existence yet, or if it wasn't
right.
conceptualized by that culture. Interesting.
Although it's easier to err farther back because we base all our knowledge on the written record. But the verbal record obviously predates that, and we have no way of measuring how much. So that gives you a little bit of wiggle room.
Right. Well, and especially with mythology and folklore, because a lot of the history of that is, religious basis, right? And so so much of that was verbal, and that varied from culture to culture. And I'm sure that, you have the oral storytelling traditions of Slavic culture. A lot of that was oral, and so doing research for those kinds of things gets real fuzzy real fast.
Well, one of the big things about the Druids is they didn't write anything down. Like, for example, Ogham isn't like a Druid language. It's a monumental script.
I did not know that.
Yeah. So Druids was entirely a memorized oral tradition.
Okay.
And so the only surviving records we really have is, from people like the Romans who were not fond of them, so they might be a little biased in their view.
Right.
Only slightly.
So with Druidry then, in the book Reluctant Druid, Liam is a Druid to begin with. He doesn't become that.
So he is we have to differentiate between neo-pagan and his magical role.
Right.
So he starts off, he's been a neo-pagan Druid. And he no longer works with groups because he got tired of the nonsense. Because like with anything else, you get more than 10 people together and you start having, disputes and petty one-upmanship. And in fact, there's a term for it in the pagan community called witch wars.
Witch wars. It's catchy at least. So with that then, what is the role, and we touched on this a little just before the podcast, was something that we wanted to discuss. The line, with your research in urban fantasy, you have to look at the difference between mythology and folklore.
Right.
Is that a distinction that you've had to make?
Yes, because mythology is very specific. It refers to religious or near-religious figures and tales. Folklore is much more general. It's basically the transition of a traditional culture. So not only is there verbal folklore, written folklore, but there's also material folklore. There's, for example, certain kinds of cooking or home remedies, ways of dress is material folklore. Saying bless you after someone sneezes, that's actually a folklore transmission because it's a traditional piece of culture.
I feel like I should be taking notes for my own writing, like all of these things that I've never considered.
I can actually recommend a book for you.
Yes, actually.
Folklore 101
Okay.
by Dr. Gina Jorgensen.
It's a good thing we're recording this podcast, so you can always go back and listen to it for notes. So if you're sitting at home listening to this, you could also take notes. And I'll make sure we drop a link in the show notes for that book.
Yeah, we'll have all the information. We'll make sure we've got all of Oz's stuff in there as well. So do you find yourself then mixing mythology and folklore when you're planning things?
I dwell more on the mythology.
Okay.
Folklore is out of my area of expertise.
Okay.
Now, if I know a piece of folklore and it's also, nifty, then I'll try to find an excuse to include it. But in general, I focus more on the mythology because also the mythology tends to be tied into the magic / religion.
That's pretty cool. It kind of makes me think though that there is some stuff that like it's both folklore and mythos. So if you touch on anything in that realm, do you try and go, even if you don't know like maybe the original starting folklore or all the details, do you try and go back and research that, or do you try and rely on just staying with the mythos?
I do try to do research, and it depends. Actually, research can actually lead you down some very interesting rabbit holes that if you find something you can use as a tool for your story, that's great. On the other hand, if you come up totally blank, that means that you can fill it in.
Do you find that you've ever had issues or concerns with reader immersion when you're blending historical things into a modern setting?
Not so much with the Milesian Accords, because if you're accepting the conceit that magic existed previously and that it actually technically still did exist but was like quiescent, then you can accept the fact that I'm tying in these mythological elements. But something that was asked earlier that I actually didn't get around to answering is there's a reason why I don't go with more popular mythological figures. Like, for example, Thor is a great example for this. Because as soon as you say Thor, everyone has an expectation. And that expectation is probably mythologically wrong.
That doesn't sound right. There's no way that pop culture would have muddied any of those waters.
Yeah, Marvel definitely didn't screw it up for everybody else.
Not just Marvel.
But I mean, that's why I go with more obscure mythological figures. You know, most people couldn't tell you who, Skaha or Govanen or Cathbad are.
And one of the things that you reference is like Govanen is one aspect of the Smith god. So there may be other iterations rather that readers may be familiar with.
Well, if they're in a Smith god, sure. But in Celtic mythology, there's almost always a Smith god figure. In Welsh, it's Govanen. In Irish, it's Goivnu. In I think Scottish, it's Goban.
Okay. And they're not, when you look at it, you just say, oh, they're not the same person.
Well, the way I defined it is that like the Govanen we see in the series is a manifested aspect.
Okay.
Might be stealing a little bit of Haley's thunder here. I can't entirely remember the list of questions she sent me, but we've talked a lot about a lot of the characters and some of the different kinds of mythos you pull from, what you avoid, what you don't. When you started the Milesian Accords as a series, and when you go through each of the books, what is your kind of brick one? Where do you go, that's the thing I want to run with? Let me, this is my kernel, this is the seed that's planting this story. Like, where did you start to develop that world building?
Well, it comes back to what is the core conflict of the story. And so, for example, the trilogy was all about trying to bring magic back to the world and tying into the Tuatha Dé Danann's loss to the Milesians originally. Once I had that conflict, then that informed those 3 books. Books 4 and 5 were more personal. The antagonist basically was a threat to the protagonist or something they loved.
Right.
So that original conflict, was that something you just had an idea for, or were you doing like some research into something else and it just kind of came around?
So originally I was going to run, because I'm a game master, I was going to run a post-apocalyptic game where magic had come back to the world and churned off technology, or like complex technology, which is not an uncommon trope. There's been several books that touch on that. And I had this idea of a druid riding an old motorcycle, across an overgrown suburban landscape. And so I did, a little bit of work on that, and then never got around to putting that game together. And then that was probably the progenitor for Liam.
Okay. So what was the gap? How long was it before you started writing the series?
Probably about 10 years.
Okay. So it percolated for a long time.
Yes.
So now it's cool probably to see it expanding and taking off. Doing as well as it is.
The way that I actually got started going is when my parents passed and I was handling their estate. Every weekend I'd have to drive up to the Chicago area to deal with stuff up there. So I'd leave work on Friday, be on the road up there, Sunday, drive back. And so while I'm driving through this route, I've done, I can do in my sleep, my brain starts going into creation mode, and just that scene popped up.
And was that the first book you wrote?
Yes.
So your background then, you've done really, really well, obviously, with Four Horsemen, and you've done a lot with that.
Right.
But your background, you started with fantasy.
Yes, because
arguably is superior. Biased.
Because I actually pitched,
And there went half our audience.
I pitched Chris a reluctant druid. Well, I soft pitched a reluctant druid to Chris at the same convention that he agreed to work on with Mark on the Four Horsemen universe. And at that point, I'd had probably about 30,000 words done. So even though I'd started writing the Milesian Accords before anything in the Four Horsemen universe, my first actual published work was the Four Horsemen universe.
Right. And then I guess that's not relevant. You wrote the whole trilogy first, or did you release them one at a time?
Released them one at a time.
You did, okay.
It was supposed to be one book, but as I like to say, pantsing is how my first book became a trilogy.
There's a lot of that, or the 4-book trilogies or the 5-book trilogies.
Although what's ironic is book 2 was basically supposed to be a training montage for Aaron, one chapter, and that's the book that got nominated for a Dragon Award.
It's a good book.
So really what you did was you made a Karate Kid 2 out of book 2. Kind of, yeah. Apparently really well done, right?
Yeah, it worked.
Yeah, it worked out for you. No, it is interesting though that, you know, especially even as like a pantser, and the three of us have had conversations about that before. But you're thinking of this thing 10 years ago. About 10 years ago, you pitched it to Chris, and then you wrote sci-fi, and then still managed to pants your way into 3 novels out of 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's fun to see, kind of like, again, coming back to the fact that this is a world building podcast, right? You know, you start really delving into it, and you've expanded out. So at what point during that first book did you recognize that the world had become bigger than just one book?
About the 50, 60,000 word mark. And then I was like, oh crap, this is getting big. Oops. And then right away, Mark Wander, he's like, just split it. No, it's one book. He's like, dude, just split it. And I'm like writing more and more. I'm like, oh crap, I'm up to 70,000. I'm not even close to the 3rd act. And he's like, dude, no one's going to buy a huge, fat George R. Martin book from a first-time author. Split it. And then I'm like, all right, fine, I'll split it. And as soon as I split it, and someone goes, it's going to be a trilogy. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, it is a trilogy.
Okay.
You owe me a trilogy. Well, so the other thing that you've discussed a lot is your background in gaming.
Right.
And working on your own campaigns and some of that kind of thing. And you have said that you sort of intended Milesian Accords from, you know, close to the beginning to be a shared world. Right.
I wanted to make a sandbox.
So obviously the whole basis of that is world building, right? Like you give someone so the process typically, I think, is that you say, here's the world, here are all of the pieces, but you haven't typically assigned, you know, plot or characters or any of those things. So people who go into your world, the most important thing is that you've established all of the groundwork.
Right.
So when you were building that world Bible, which is something that I think that everyone should do, even if you're writing your own series, if you're not intending to do a shared world, tracking everything that you're doing is really important, because then when you're writing book 5, you remember, you know, a certain magical term that you used or what color your character's eyes were. But when you're building that for just the world, what were the most important things that you focused on to make sure that people who picked it up could get a feel for what you were creating?
I think the most important part, and this is probably, actually for fantasy or science fiction in general, is, so for fantasy it's magic, science fiction is technology.
Okay.
You have to have the rules for those, because in both cases, if you don't have a defined rule from them, they could easily become a way to short circuit your story. Mm-hmm. You know, why don't they use magic or technology to fix the story problem?
And that's one of the first things that you address in your book. That's like the 3rd or 4th chapter. So when you're developing the magic, what kind of considerations for that do you have to look at? What are the different aspects? Or I know there's the argument between hard magic and soft magic and the different rules that go into that.
So I wanted to be careful and not have what I call video game magicians, where it's just, we're going to throw rays of colored light. You know, thank you, Harry Potter movies. Mm-hmm. But I also wanted to kind of tie it in to the various sources of magic. So for example, you know, druids, witches, celestials, they all have very, very different limitations on what they can and can't do. Mm-hmm. You know, for example, celestials are the only ones that have access to true healing magic.
So how do you choose those rules? Like, how do you define them?
So for druids, I started with druids first because that was what my main character was. Mm-hmm. And so I looked at the druidry I practiced, and it's opposed to the 4 element system that you see in, like, you know, witchcraft and other similar magic systems. Mm-hmm. We use the 3 realms, so land, sky, and sea, and it also ties into God, spirits, and ancestors.
Gotcha.
And so, like, for example, you know, Liam has an affinity for sky. Mm-hmm. So, like, the wind spirits are always around him. He finds that kind of magic a lot easier. Whereas, as another character, so I won't spoil it, has an affinity, turns out, for earth magic.
I know who that is. I also won't spoil it.
And technically, we see one with water magic in one brief scene.
That character might be eluding me right now.
You were so smug, too.
And then, so witches goes more back to my experience with Wicca.
Right. Okay.
And one of the things I wanted them to be able to do was, because it is kind of a trope, and while I try to avoid a lot of cliches, I was just, okay, they have to be able to like light stuff. Because if you've been around anything Wicca, you know how many candles and crap that they light. And it's always a thing of like, like when someone's like learning magic, the new witch is like, one of the first exercises they do is lighting a candle.
Well, and that's a really graphic visual too,
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, right? You mentioned the Wicca have that lighting the candle stuff. It's like almost synonymous with the term witchcraft. Almost always, as you think of the some sort of diagram drawn into the ground, some sort of article sitting around, but always candles. Always candles. It doesn't matter what's in the center, there's always candles.
Well, or light in general, because even in Harry Potter, Lumos is one of the first spells that you learn in the books.
That's I consider that J.K. Rowling's equivalent of candle lighting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then witches are also, of course, more tied into spirit magic.
Okay.
Like we see a lot of the witches, like are quicker to pick up things like spirit walking. And as we've seen in some other stories, they sometimes call spirits.
Whether it be intentionally or otherwise.
Welcome back to the end of yet another episode of Worlds Asunder. Hopefully you managed to learn something today as we got to talk with the great and powerful Oz, Jon R. Osborne. And remember, if you want to get more advice from him, just #BringOzBeer. Get that man some beer. Thanks for stopping by. As always, you can follow any of this cast of characters on any of the links that we throw into our show notes. And next time, we'll finish our chat with Oz in #BringOzBeer Part 2. Like, subscribe, and comment to this podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. Let us know what you're thinking. And finally, thanks for helping us tear the worlds asunder. We'll see you next time.